I love it. It's great. So we are, like I said, in the middle of a series called Controversial Jesus. Here's what I'm going to do for the next few minutes. All right, I'm going to get us caught up pretty quick. So I'm going to get us caught up from last week. Then we're going to take a deep dive. Now, I'll say this. If you're here and you're not a follower of Jesus, for the next few minutes, I'll say this. You're going to agree with some of the things that I say. Some of the things I'm going to say, you're probably not going to agree with, and that's totally okay. This is part of the reason we talk about it, is for you to process some of the things that we're saying about Christianity. And then for those of you who are followers of Jesus, let me say this. We're going to get about a third of the way through, and I'll try to prompt you when we get there. About a third of the way through, and you're going to go, oh, yeah, that's for somebody else, or that's for, but I'm literally talking to you, and I promise you'll give me a few minutes, we'll kind of rein you back in. So when we say controversial, I wanted to just identify this so that we could all be on the same page. When we talk about the word controversial, it's this idea of arousing disagreement or discussion. And what we said was, this is how Jesus lived, right? Jesus was controversial sort of out the gate, right? I put in my notes this way, that Jesus was controversial in his birth, he was controversial in his life, he was controversial in his teachings, controversial in his ethics, miracles, death, resurrection, relationships. When you read through the Gospels, you don't get to a section where Jesus isn't controversial, right? Now, when we read it, as people who have been followers of Jesus for a long time, or if you've been around the church for a long time, a lot of the things that he taught don't feel controversial in 2025, and yet, they would be wildly controversial in the times that he taught in, right? And so what we said last week, and I know I'm giving you a Spark Note version really fast, but what we said was this, that oftentimes followers of Jesus, right, we want a Jesus without the controversy. We just want a Jesus without the controversy. Or we want a Jesus who looks like us, did the things that we agree with, all of that. And we want Jesus on our own terms, right? We want Jesus to do the things that we think Jesus should do. We want him not to say and do the things that we don't want him to do. In a political election cycle, this is never more apparent. You can look at all the parties and you can see whatever version of Jesus they talk about, and it's the right one, right? And everybody cherry picks the verses and everybody sort of makes it out to be what it is. And at the end of the day, right, who is the real Jesus? So we talked about this quote from Tim Keller. It's so powerful. There's going to be two quotes right off the bat, but his first one is this. Dr. Tim Keller says it this way. He says, if your God never disagrees with you, right, you might be worshiping an idealized version of yourself, which is one of the most powerful. I just think is so good. Which means if you read the New Testament in particular, if you read through the scriptures and you never find yourself disagreeing with anything, if you never find yourself going, well, I don't know about that. If you ever look at the teachings of Jesus and go, man, that hurts. I don't know that I like that. I don't know if I agree with that approach. If you look at it that way, I'm just telling you, what most of the time is happening is a person who isn't looking at the real version of Jesus. What they're doing is they're looking at an idealized version of themselves, which is what we really want to follow a lot of the times, right? When you look at the leaders that you look at, when you look at that sort of thing, often we want to follow the people who are slightly better at us or a little bit better than us than we think we are. We want to follow him to whatever the next better version of ourselves is. The problem is the New Testament Jesus isn't that person for us. In fact, the New Testament Jesus says that he is Lord of our lives. And then this is, again, the sort of fun part that nobody likes. And it calls us to submit to his way and his will and his new kingdom in the world. And it's not like, well, and if we all agree, that's not what he's doing. He is calling people to that new kingdom. Now, there's another writer who I love. One of her books on writing is actually one of my favorite books of all time. But her name is Anne Lamott, and she has another beautiful picture of this. She says it this way. She says, you can safely assume that you've created God in your own image when it turns out that God hates all the same people that you do. Like Phillies fans, you know what I mean? We can all, I'm a Braves guy. You get this, if when God hates all the same people that you do, or stands against all the same people that you do, or rejects all the same people that you do, then there's a part of you that can look in the mirror and go, well, it's probably just me that I'm worshiping, or an idealized version of me. And so we can live our lives and we can move through our lives in a very interesting way where we avoid all the controversy that's connected to our faith, all the controversy that's connected specifically to Jesus, simply because we're not actually worshiping Jesus. We're worshiping a different version of what we've painted him to be, right? So I put it in my notes, said this. I said, if we claim to follow Jesus and there's no personal or public controversy, and I'll explain this in a sec, in our lives, and we really have to ask the question, which Jesus am I actually following, right? If there's never a point privately where you look and go, I don't know what to do with this thing, I wrestle through, I struggle with this, I disagree with this, then privately, you are probably not engaging with the real Jesus. You're just reading into the text oftentimes what you want to be there. And then here's the hard part. And then publicly, if publicly there's a part of you that never embraces any sort of controversy. Now, I'm not talking about being that uncle on Facebook. Do you know what I'm talking about? Like, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about just stirring the pot to stir the fire. That's not what I'm talking about. But if you never experience any sort of loss because you're a person who has faith, then it's likely, and again, not to be a jerk about it, but it's likely not just because you're so wise and good. Because most of that controversy doesn't even apply to just how wise and good you are. It's the statements and the truth that Jesus presents and what this new kingdom actually represents in the world. Which means if you go your entire life with no sort of public, and not like public with tens of thousands of people, not cancel culture, that stuff, but like at your office or with your family or with close friends or with your person who cuts your hair or like anything like that, if you never experience any of that controversy, right? Which means it arouses some form of pushback or disagreement. And you're likely not either talking about your faith or you're only talking about the parts of your faith with people that you know that they already agree with and moves forward, right? So today, that's kind of what we talked about last week. Today we're gonna pick up from there. So I told you last week was kind of the intro section. This week will be a continuation of the intro section. I'm just kidding. No, we'll move forward from there. The idea that they got posed several years ago, I believe he's in his 90s now, but there is a philosopher, Canadian philosopher, which is so fascinating. His name is Charles Taylor, has so many great articles and even books around this idea. Charles Taylor, back in the mid-90s, I believe, what he did is he wrote an essay, and he's writing specifically about people, morality, how people interact with all of these things. And he writes this essay specifically entitled The Politics of Recognition. It's published in the early 90s, and then he presents it at Princeton. And in the midst of what he's talking about, he shares a thought and idea that sort of is the framework that we're going to spend our time taking a little bit of a deep dive in today. And here's the quote that he says, and again, I think it's fascinating. Here's what he says. He says, the understanding of life which emerges with romantic expressivism of the late 18th century, he says this, that each one of us has his or her own way of realizing our humanity, right? This is gonna be where we launch from today. And that it is important to find and live out one's own, and then he says it this way, he goes on, we go to the next one. Yeah, he says, as against surrendering to conformity, right? So this is where we spend our time, the idea of surrendering to conformity. With a model imposed on us from outside by society or the previous generation or religious or political authority, there's a piece of us that resists that naturally in our culture. So last week we talked about this framework in some ways from a macro level, but personally, it's very true for most of us, and it's a little bit of a newer sort of playing out of thought processes, right? Now, what's happened, and he's spot on this, what we do and what many of us are taught early on, right, and I was taught this too, is to embrace a framework or a way of thinking that prioritizes you at the center of just about everything in your life, and ultimately paints a picture of you finding your own way to your own individual, version or expression of yourself. Now, it's not that all of that is bad, right? This is every Disney movie that you've ever seen. Am I right? Do we have any Disney fans in the room? Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah. So you get this. This is most movies that you see. A person that they start out and they're moving through life trying to understand and figure out the world, but mostly they're trying to figure out themselves. Now, what has happened over time, and this is sort of the cultural moment that we're living in currently, it's always shifting, but certainly where we are now, is the vast majority of accepted truth of around how we think about and process our own individuality focuses on this, that we no longer bow to external morals, right? You or the moral authority of your life. Nobody says it quite like this, but this is like, and you kind of laugh, this is the your truth version. This is the versions of your life where it's like whatever sort of feels right to you, and you can always fast forward to a point, and the point that you fast forward to, it breaks down at some point, right? Or a segment where we should all agree on it. But we reject the external morals. And the second thing is this, external moral codes are often seen as oppressive, while moral relativism is viewed as a normative approach. Now, here's why this matters, and I know we're just jumping the deep end quick. Here's why this matters so much. In a culture that focuses on a moral relativism in the ways that we talk about and we experience, right? Objective truth isn't just like resisted, it's viewed as an oppressive thing. And what's happened over the course of the last 120 to 150-ish years is that Christianity, when taught within Orthodoxy, I really believe this, doesn't present a set of ethics or morality that's chosen to be adopted or not. Jesus doesn't come to suggest who you might become. He comes as Lord, which means this. So over the course of the last, however many years, Christianity in large part has all of its mess. So if you're here and you're not a follower of Jesus and you're like, well, let's talk about the Crusades. I'd love to talk about that. Yes, awful, yes. Talks about, you pull passages from the Old Testament to justify slavery, like these kinds of moments. You have people who act ridiculously stupid about what Christianity is and all of these sorts of things. The vast majority of what you hear about, absolutely. Or we sort of tag evangelical to a whole way of thinking in a group of people, which is really just meaning political right? When you get all of those kinds of things together, what people often do is package all that up and say, this is what Christianity is, and it gets tossed because this feels oppressive, right? But Christian teaching and orthodoxy around these sorts of things, don't miss this, is that Jesus comes as Lord. He invites you into following this new kingdom in the world. And it's not ambiguous what he calls you to do. And what he calls you to do is to die to yourself and follow him. Now, when you look at this, what Christianity has done over this time period is moved from the center to the fringe, from public to a private expression of your faith, from strange to viewed as a threat, from tolerance to some version of penalization. Now, let me stop right here. This is my fun pause. If we're gonna press pause and talk, here's what it is. Some of you are immediately going, well, he's about to get very political on what he's gonna teach out over the next few minutes. Can I just tell you something? It's not at all where I'm about to go. Or you're going, like the next 15 minutes, he's gonna tell me all of the ways, and you've had all of your justice issues, social things, that you feel like that's not where we're about to go. All right. I wanna cut deeper into the core of all of this. Now, if you're a part of the older generation, I'm gonna let you define that however you want to, right? So however you define this. There's a piece of this where what rises up in people that are slightly older is this, right? It feels like a fear due to rapid cultural shifts that happen fairly rapidly, specifically in the US. And often the immediate response to this is some form of self-preservation or condemnation to anything that feels like a threat to that thing. And here's what's so fascinating about the politics of it, which means that at some form or fashion, politics becomes some version of a new religion that feels like it's safer than Christianity because Christianity gets pushed to the side. So in a lot of ways, it's always fascinating to me. If you have fun on Twitter or X, what like I do, if you go and you look, the vast majority of what you see that it gets any sort of traction are massive emotional responses to politics, which is often just substituted for what religion used to be in that space, right? And so this is where it gets so fascinating. What you see here is like a self-preservation and a deep condemnation for anything that feels like it pushes back on this. Some of you grew up in churches like this, where the only thing you remember about your church was a group of people who did this, right? Some of you remember this. You're like, look, I'm just listening to the Spice Girls. It can't be that bad, and it's certainly better than Twyla Paris. I don't know. These are fun 90s references. I don't know. That was awful. I don't even know who Twyla Paris is. Anyway, so you got all these, you got all these references. You go like, I'm not trying to do anything, but somebody somewhere was like this, I laugh at my mom. I think we're gonna say this. We'll probably cut this out of YouTube because my mom watches these. I got John Mayer's first album because I wanted to learn how to play jazz guitar in a pop way. Right when I first started playing guitar, my mom got me the album. You remember the song that he won the Grammy for? I probably won't say that out loud on stage, but she took the song that was for married people on the album and literally paid about $100 to have that taken off of a burned thing and then reburned it on Napster. My mom used Napster. Anyway, got me the disc back. Now, I'm like a sophomore in high school. I'm looking at her going, I know how it works. Do you know what I'm saying? Like I figured it, but there's a piece of this where I got this album back and I laughed going, I don't even know that she's wrong about that. And also there's a piece of this that goes, anything that's outside of whatever this thing is, it feels, even if it's wrong, right? It feels like condemnation to the individual. Now, there's a whole swath of younger, specifically men, who are adopting this now or who have adopted this over the last 10 to 15 years. Like, I'm overgeneralizing, but certainly this is rising back up in different areas. But in general, the condemnation thing feels like self-preservation, right? Now, the second one that is equally, and this doesn't get acknowledged very often, that is equally as toxic, but it's certainly not viewed that way anymore, is this. I'm gonna put this up, all right? Younger generation, overwhelming cultural pressure specifically towards this tendency to indiscriminate celebration and some version of compromise. Now, here's what this means, right? And this is like Gen Z friends. I'm kind of in the middle of some of this, but like millennials certainly feel this. Oftentimes is a version of this. This is the your truth stuff. This is where you go, you know what? I feel pressure in every direction from different things. I feel pressure when it comes to sexual ethics. I feel pressure when it comes to my view of, supernatural things. I feel pressure from all of these different, I could go a whole list. Constant pressure. And here's what the response oftentimes of a younger generation is. I feel all this pressure. I don't know what to do. Can't I just love Jesus? I believe in the resurrection. Yes. And I kind of wish I could skip out on the controversial Jesus series stuff, but I forgot that he was doing that. So I'm here today. There's all these sorts of things that you go, I just want to live a little bit more in peace. And what that leads to more times than not is either some version of compromise through silence, or a version where you look at this and go, you end up publicly celebrating things that you privately don't agree with because you feel like you're forced to. Some of you feel like you're forced to do this at work, that you are forced to celebrate things that you privately disagree with. It's always fascinating to me, especially here in political. Politicians who have gone on record and saying privately, I disagree with X, Y, Z, whatever it is. They figure out whatever that thing is, and then publicly come back and celebrate it. You're like, what happened? And if you listen to the language, they rarely say I changed my mind. They just reinforce what's publicly celebrated. And it becomes so interesting. Because privately, you're like, what's going on? And there's a disconnect. And the reason is there are so many different pressures from all these different places to celebrate and to compromise. And both of these things are equally toxic. Both of these things are not the way of Jesus. And both of these things lead us to a place, and this is where I'm just to be really honest with you, where you find yourself to some version of apathy. Apathy and the deep condemnation, because the deep condemnation side of this removes the people from your life that Jesus called you to spend your life with. And on the compromise side of this, right, it causes you to be apathetic because all you do is turn your faith into some version of a private thing that you privately question and don't actually work out in community because you can't say the thing out loud, right? And in the midst of this, we're going to spend our time today talking. This is what Jesus modeled. It's this idea of controversial compassion, right? Now, we're going to talk about this. We're going to look at a passage of scripture for a second, but I'll say this. Compassion doesn't mean I just feel empathy. So this is where we're going to spend our time. It's not just feeling empathy. Compassion is an action-oriented framework that moves you to do something, right? So we're going to spend some time in an area of the Bible called Luke. If you're unfamiliar with the New Testament, Luke's a doctor, physician, and very detailed in his accounts of what was going on. He would go around, interview people, bring back these narratives and these stories, gets it on paper. That's what he's working on doing. Right? And so you get these very fascinating accounts of both Jesus' life and what happened. And so we're picking up in an area of the Bible, Luke chapter 7. I'm going to read you the first couple of verses, and then we'll explain where we're at in terms of context, right? So this is Luke chapter 7. Here's what it says. When one of the Pharisees, these are religious leaders, but specifically religious leaders who are focused on the law and keeping the law, right? When one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him, he went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table, right? And a woman in that town who lived in a sinful life. Now, again, the original language, the context around this, sinful can mean all sorts of different things. There's all sorts of assumptions around the sexual ethics around this, but more than not, she's just known as a person who's living a sinful life. When she learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house, so she came there with an alabaster jar of perfume, which is a very important and expensive way of having perfume, right? So she shows up. Now the historical context around this, again, is very easy to miss when you read it quick. And I know I'm going fast through it, but the historical context around this is that often Pharisees would invite rabbis to their home And as they did, there's a certain sort of like customs that you have. Now, I'm from the South, right? So South Carolina is a little bit different, but up here, especially when we live in Michigan, how many of you like take your shoes off when you go to somebody's house? That's what you immediately do just in case. You know what I'm talking about? That's because it snows, people. In the South Carolina, I saw snow twice. You know what we did? I wore my shoes with my footy pajamas. Like, you know what I mean? Like, we never took our shoes off, right? So I walk into people's houses now, and I'm like, oh, people, everybody else does it. I went into somebody's house yesterday, and I realized I'm standing in their kitchen. I'm the only person with shoes on. You know what I mean? And there's a part of this where like there's just natural customs that we have even in our culture. Here, it's actually like not just a custom, but it's a way of showing honor and respect specifically to rabbis that come in, right? So what often happens and what we're going to see is that the person who's hosting the party would greet specifically a rabbi who comes in like with a kiss. There are these moments where you would have this like almost like cleaning sort of thing that happens when they come in. Like there's all of these fascinating things that happen. When Jesus comes, right, those things apparently don't happen when he shows up to this dinner. Now, it's a fairly big deal because it comes off passive aggressive in the moment, right? And the reason it comes off passive aggressive is because when he comes, there's this honor that's supposed to be given, and then all of a sudden this sinful woman shows up and does the things that weren't done in the beginning, right? So we'll go on, here's what it says. Verse 38 says, as she stood behind him, right, this woman, at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. And then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them. Now, again, you can read this kind of quickly and you go, it's kind of weird. Like you don't show up to somebody's house and kiss their feet. At least I hope you don't if you come over to ours. Like it's kind of odd. What's happening here is very deeply cultural. It matters very deeply. And also for the people who check all the boxes and look at the law, right? This is wildly uncomfortable. A woman showing up, kissing the feet of a man. Again, this is intimate in our culture, certainly intimate here. Sinful woman, all of these sorts of things, all of the cultural components of this feel off in the moment. And so what happens next, I'm just gonna say, is actually a fairly natural response to the moment. What happens next isn't necessarily odd, and then Jesus is gonna flip it all on its head. All right, here's what happens next. It goes on, it says this in verse 39. When the Pharisee, Simon, who had invited him, saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of woman she is, and that she is a sinner. Now, I'm just gonna tell you, like, that's not wildly off to the culture and what's actually happening. The fact that Jesus is letting it happen is just, it's just weird. Now, Simon already has passive aggressiveness kind of thing going on. And they're obviously looking and testing Jesus in all these different ways, but you find this moment where she is broken and bold in what she does in this moment. This would have been around the time where Jesus was moving towards the peak of some of his ministry. Word would have gotten out. You also see Jesus claiming to be the Messiah at these moments. So she's coming broken and she's coming bold to him, expecting something powerful. So Jesus answers this Pharisee named Simon. And I think it's a fascinating way. Here's what he says. Jesus answers and he says, Simon, I have something to tell you. It's kind of like, he said it to himself. So you ever been to that moment? Have you ever had a moment where you were called out? Like you said something to somebody else, but the person you were talking about heard you? Have you ever had one of these before? Like you whispered something and then all of a sudden they heard you and they asked you to repeat it. And then you all of a sudden had to go to the bathroom real bad. You went flush real quick. You had like all these sorts of, like, this is a fascinating thing. He's like, well, tell me. Yeah, well, tell me. And then what Jesus does is he gives a parable. And the parable that he's gonna give, let me just say, if I could pull you back into this one, the parable that he's gonna give is poignant for the moment that he gave it, but it is like surgery to the modern person's heart. Here's what he says. He says, 2 people owed money to a certain moneylender. One owed him 500 denarii and the other one 50. So you got one person owing 500, the other person owing 50. Neither of them had the money to pay him back. So he forgave the debts of both. Now, which of them will love him more? And then he just kind of waits, which of them would love him more? Now, this isn't like is this a trick question? They didn't have to like sit around and think and talk about this. Right. Your answer is also probably right. Simon replies with this. He goes, I suppose the one who had the bigger debt forgiven. And Jesus says, you have judged correctly. One person owing 50, one person owing 500, both are forgiven. Who comes back and loves the person more? It was the one with 500. And then Jesus says this. It says, then he turned towards the woman and he says to Simon, right? He turns towards the woman. If you can picture it, turns towards the woman, but he says to Simon, do you see this woman? Which is like, this is the critical junction of the whole interaction. Not like, did you know that she's here? But like, did you see them? Those of you parents, you know exactly what I'm talking about, right? Like, your kids are in the living room. Do you know what I'm talking about? And it's different when you like are in the floor, looking them in the eyes, you see them. Do you know what I'm talking about? And sometimes your kid will remind you that you don't see them, I tell a story all the time. One of the most heartbreaking and great moments of parenting for me is when my daughter, I was on my phone, she's sitting next to me and she's doing all this stuff and she literally like takes my face and moves it away from the phone to look at her and then does the thing. And I'm smiling on the inside like, I suck. You know what I mean? Like there's both of those things. Like demanding attention to see, like for real see the person. Do you see this woman? I came to your house. Let me go back, sorry. I came to your house. You didn't give me any water for my feet. You didn't do the sort of ceremonial cleaning that happened in this moment. But she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. Then it goes on. It says this. It says, you didn't give me a kiss. Which again, customary as a rabbi comes in to welcome. But this woman, from the time I entered, has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not put oil on my head, but she has poured perfume on my feet. Therefore, I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven. As her great love has shown. But whoever has been forgiven little, loves little. It's so easy to pass through, but don't miss this. This is where it cuts for many of us. Most of us in the room are good enough people overall through the course of our lives or at some point to not feel desperate for the forgiveness of Jesus. And what he's doing is he's juxtaposing the two. There's the person who felt like they kept all the rules, who was working hard to complete the thing, to check all the boxes, to do all of that. And their immediate response, and don't miss this, is condemnation for the person who doesn't hold the standard, right? And then on the other side of this, you have this woman desperate to be in the presence of Jesus in this way and comes, and don't miss this, and does everything that Simon didn't do. And Jesus says to her, he says, your sins are forgiven. And the other guests begin to say amongst themselves, well, who is this who even forgives sins? Because he's calling this out. And Jesus says to the woman, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. Now, I've heard this story all my life. I've read this since I was like 9 years old. I read this with like flannel graph people. Do you know what I'm talking about? Like they did the whole thing. I had a Sunday school teacher who broke open perfume. You know what Red Door is? You know what I'm talking about? I don't know, but like broke it open and there it was. Like this sort of thing. Like we've had these moments. You know what I'm saying? And every illustration of this is so fascinating because you hear it, and when you hear it for the first however many times you hear it, most of us identify with a woman first, and the vast majority of us are Simon. The vast majority of us, if we're honest, just don't feel desperate like that. And subtly, and here's how you know, subtly, the condemnation thing in you rises up. Now, you don't say it out loud because you're smart, but it rises up in you every time you're on social media, every time you experience these moments, anytime you're around that family member, it rises up in you. And there's two specific temptations around this that we're going to poke at, right? The temptations around this from the story is this. Simon's temptation, which is the condemnation version. And then there's the modern affirmation of things that you shouldn't affirm. First one is this, right? Temptation to condemn is this internal judgment that's based on social and religious norms that many of us have been brought up into. And it's also a version of holiness that's misunderstood as separation from people who are sinners, as if we weren't sinners ourselves. This is the version of you, come on, this is the version of you that feels slightly better than, you just don't say it out loud. It's the version of you that keeps all of the things and is wise enough and is smart enough, and you haven't felt like you've blown up your whole life. And there's piece of this where you're a pretty good person. And come on, you just don't feel desperate for that. And what rises up oftentimes is a version of the condemnation towards other people. The second temptation, this is one I'd poke at, especially for people who are younger, and you look at this and you go, I don't know, I have all these pressures. The second temptation around this that many of us feel is this, temptation to celebrate without repentance, right? You just have a version of compromise that's either based in silence or based in repackaging it in a way where you go, did it really say that? Is it really that thing? And you just find yourself in that space long enough to go, I don't know what really is anymore. But I'm going to be as much of a follower of Jesus to the point where he's not Lord of my life, but he is helpful to me. The problem with that is it's just not Christianity. It's just not Jesus. It's you being a little bit better, which means at some point along the way, you could substitute something else for Jesus as long as it helps you to be a little bit better. Or many times what we do is we take a version of Jesus that doesn't actually exist, attach so many things to whatever this is, and do away with the parts that we don't want. Thomas Jefferson, many of you know the story, it's so fascinating. He literally took a Bible, which is so fun. I meant to put up the pictures. Cuts many of the pieces out, specifically around supernatural things, and then would literally cut out and paste other sections to it, and then says, here's a new version of this, which is so interesting. You should actually Google the picture. I wish I could put them up here. And you go like, oh, if you've been a follower of Jesus, that might mess with your head a little bit. And also, that's exactly what we do, you know? Like, I'm all about you engaging in your Bible and highlighting. I do that too. The problem with a highlighter is that it just pulls out all the stuff that you think is interesting and leaves behind all the rest. And also I use a highlighter. But I'm just saying, like that's the mindset around this. So the third way is what we talked about earlier, and this is kind of the overarching theme that we're gonna kind of move through the rest of the series with. The third way of Jesus is different. Right, the third way of Jesus is this. We can go this, yeah. Recognition specifically of the woman's humanity. So this is the part where you find Jesus going, like, do you see her? Like, not just her, but the fullness of this person. Do you see her? And then you see the grace and transformation that comes. And can I tell you something? Like, this is the part that I go, man, I wish I could pull everybody and convince you of this thing, and that's this. That Jesus doesn't choose either or in these moments. Now, I still teach versions of this over time, but the phrase that often gets used is like grace and truth. You've heard us talk about this. You guys have heard this, right? You know, Jesus is the fullness of grace and truth. Here's what I realized after like the last 8 or 9 years teaching this sort of thing, is that everybody latches onto the grace side, and then most of us latch onto the truth side. But what the truth thing does is something can be true but not require anything of you. Right? Like, what's true doesn't mean that you have to do anything. So we talk about like messy compassion. It's not just grace and frameworks of truth. It's grace and some form of deep engagement around what truth means for you. There's a section of the New Testament, it's called Titus. And I love talking about this particular verse because it actually highlights this idea so well. Here's what the writer says. So, for the grace of God has appeared that offers salvation to all people, offered to all people. It teaches us to say, and this is the part that, again, goes up against the sort of general affirmation of things that we don't want to engage with. It teaches us to say no to ungodliness and worldly passions, and to live, and again, this is fascinating, to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives in this present age based on whose standards? Not yours, not mine, his. The empowerment to say no in light of holiness based off of his standards and living self-controlled in that space. If you're not a follower of Jesus in the room, can I just say this? My gut says that even if you disagreed with Christianity or even disagreed with the ethics that Jesus or the New Testament taught, right? You would probably respect Christianity more if more Christians took this more seriously. Well, what do you think about it, right? Well, I have all these thoughts about it. But Jesus is Lord of my life. I choose submission there. There's a writer named Brennan Manning. This is a long quote. I know it is. So maybe we'll post it or something. But sometimes people use words so well that just like Zorro it. Do you know what I'm talking about? And I love the way that he packages this. He says it this way: by entering human history, God has demolished all previous conceptions of who God is and what man is supposed to be. We are suddenly presented with a God who suffers crucifixion. This is not the God of the philosophers who speaks with cool detachment about a supreme being. He says it this way: a supreme being would never allow spit on his face. Don't miss this. He's talking about Jesus going to the cross, the dishonor of people, literally, we talked about this before, being hung at eye level, where people could walk by, spit on him, right? The supreme would never allow spit on his face. And then he goes on and he says this: Jesus Christ has irreparably changed the world. When preached purely, his word exalts, frightens, shocks, and forces us to reassess our whole life. This is what happens when you read the text, spiritually empowered and putting yourself aside to say, you are Lord first. Shape me and transform me. The gospel breaks our train of thought, shatters our comfortable piety, and cracks open our capsule truths. He says, the flashing spirit of Jesus Christ, breaks new paths everywhere. How do I get you to visualize this? I saw this video this week. How many of you don't like heights? Anybody not like heights like me? Where's Dargan at? Dargan, that's what he does for a job. Psychopath. Anyway, so I'm totally kidding. Dargan's one of the most amazing guys. All right, but I want you to we had this there's this glass bridge where I grew up, and one of the glasses was cracked, and they didn't close the bridge because South Carolina, I guess. And I watched them. They did a video of one of it when it cracked, and it was like a small thing, it was like a boop, and then it was like whoosh. You ever seen this before? You ever seen glass cracked or something like that? It doesn't just crack. It spreads to new paths. It's such a great visual of when Jesus is doing surgery on your heart and transforming your life. It's not just one, it is a new path everywhere inside of you. And then he goes on and he says this. His sentences stand like quivering swords of flame because he did not come to bring peace, but a revolution. The gospel is not a children's fairy tale, but rather a cutting edge, rolling thunder, convulsive earthquake in the world of the human spirit. Jesus did not come for you to repackage him, to control him to be whatever you want him to be. He came as Lord. He came to upend the parts of your heart that are broken and to bring redemption and healing to those things. And it says, which is what made Christianity irresistible in its earliest form. It wasn't just people who checked the boxes. It was people who experienced the power of Jesus in their heart and in their lives. And I'll tell you, I'm Simon. I'm the one who can feel very good about all of the boxes that I check. feel good about the life that I live, and miss what Jesus is actually upending and doing. Tyson has this list that I'm pretty sure he pulled from Keller. And here's the list that he sort of talks about with this, which is so good. He says it this way. We go to the next one. He says this. It's reconciliation amidst offense. Period. All offense. Reconciliation amidst offense. It's nuanced amidst polarization. When everything around you and your world is wanting you to be polarized, you go, I refuse, I'm going to be nuanced. It's humanity amidst the issues that people have. You see the human in the person. It's holiness amidst secularism. This is so, private and public holiness in the midst of everything else that says, if it's yours, you should take it if it feels good, right? It's generosity amidst consumerism. It's the person who goes, all of this is from him, and because it's from him, I don't have to worry. I can be generous with my life, my time, my resources. It's faith amidst fear, and it's deep love amidst hate. All right, so here's where we're gonna wrap up, or at least put an ellipses. I told you every message that we do will have an ellipses moving into the next one. If not, it'd be like an 11-hour message, and you don't want that, though I do. That would be fun. There's an area of the Old Testament that has all of these fascinating prophecies in the midst of it. But then there's like a handful of like statements that are made that paint a really beautiful picture of who God is and what is to come. So in Isaiah 30, I want to end with this passage. It's going to lead us into next week. It says this. It says, yet the Lord longs to be gracious to you. Therefore he will, and I want you to visualize this, he will rise up to show you compassion. For the Lord is a God of justice. Blessed are all who wait for him. Now, this is another one of these passages, can I just say this, that feels a little churchy, and I know that. Because you don't often say blessed, you know. But the image here, I think, is so fascinating because it paints a picture of the God of the universe who wants to be gracious to you. So this is where we're gonna. This is what will ellipses us into the next week. I grew up a fairly decent kid. You know, I didn't get in a lot of trouble. Certainly did stupid things, but not like overly stupid things. You know. And I grew up. Some of you know this, like in a Southern Baptist background, and then a deeply charismatic background. And both of those often at the same time, right? So if you know either one of those worlds, I had a fun growing up. It was really cool. And something happened to me along the way that was interesting, and that's this. I felt like God called me to do the things that I'm doing. I do feel that way. And at the same time, what I did is I worked so hard not to mess up and make mistakes. And this isn't for everybody, but this is for like a handful of you that's going to move us into next week. Here's what I'm saying. And I wasn't perfect, but I did a decent job of it. I did a decent job of checking as many of the boxes that a person checks as a middle schooler, high schooler, kid who goes to Christian school, changes his major 5 times, eventually becomes a ministry major, and married the best one at the whole school, right? So this is me in my 20s. And then I got jobs in churches that required holiness to be there, you know? And here's what I realized, and it took me a long time. I'm 37. It took me a long time to see something. And that's this. All of the Jesus getting pissed off at Pharisees in the New Testament, it's so poignant because what it does is it actually gives you a glimpse into what the heart of God is like. And that's this. He's not just looking for people who are good. And I said this last week, part of the reason we're doing this series is this. Most of you are good. Like you're reputable humans. You're smart. You're wise. You do good things. And most of you don't overwhelmingly condemn other people. if we're just honest, we just slightly feel better than sometimes, right? But here's what I missed until like a year and a half ago. And it's this. I found that it was hard for me to make even the smallest mistakes in my life. Because what I actually doubted was whether God would give a second chance to that. That I didn't need to be perfect, but I need to be perfect enough. I need to be good enough, sort of things. And then you hear stories like the prodigal son. Can we do this? Where the father like rises up to run after the son. And can I just tell you something? I got it as long as I was the father running after the broken one. I did not feel it at all as the son coming home. And you know why? Because I'm not the son coming home most of the time. I'm the other son going, I feel like I did the things, and sometimes I mess up, but I'm not perfect, but I did pretty good, you know? And can I tell you why this matters so much for some of you? You don't feel like you need God because somewhere along the way you have some version of suppressed or convinced yourself that what he requires of you is some performative thing that you've been given to do a certain amount of things, to be good enough, to acquire a certain amount of things. And the problem is, until you fully recognize and experience the kindness and the grace and the love of God, it is hard for us to extend that to others in the ways that he extends it to us. Which means you could do all of the right things and fully swing and miss on messy compassion with other people. The part of the verse that I want to like bother you this week is the part where it says he will rise up to show you compassion. This is the father rising up to run after the son because he simply loves the son, and he was always a son first. If your propensity is some version of condemning people, I'll just tell you, you will always feel empty in some version of that. For those of you who take and repackage and conform what is true to be not actually real, or you feel the pressures to just privately cave to those things, you will never feel fulfilled there. I think the only way to experience the fullness of the grace of God is to stand in light of the fullness of sin and go, but yet you rose up with your graciousness to me and ran after me too. And then inspired by, ignited by, with the awareness of, we become people who never minimize what sin is or the effect of sin. We stand with the fullness of it and call it what it is. And don't just embrace truth, but then embrace the fullness of engaging people and loving people through that as well. Let me pray for us. Father, we thank you so much for these passages, these moments, these sorts of things. That when we pause long enough to process that, God, you are using in us. And so I ask for the person whose propensity is to like rise up and condemn to some degree. God, I pray that you'd break that in them and they would see people as humans. Just as you called Simon to do, God, that we would see the person in front of us fully. And God, in the ways that you show grace, in the ways that you rise up for us, the ways that you pursue us with graciousness and kindness and forgiveness. Father, I ask that you would help us to not just know that, but to feel that. For the person in the room who's been a follower of Jesus for a long time, and they just slightly miss it because they're good. Father, I ask that you would help them to see their own sin in light of what you have called them to be, and God, that you would help them to experience your unending love for them as well. And I pray for all of us when it comes to the pressures that we feel, when it comes to compromise, when it comes to adjusting holiness to fit whatever a cultural perception of that might be. And I pray that we never do that, in part because doing that minimizes the work and the power of what your grace is actually doing in our hearts and our lives. So I pray that you would help us to be both, people full of grace, but also people who are full of this messy compassion that you've called us to. So in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.